هذا اليوم، وهي عن التحديات والوقائع والخيارات حول عولمة الأعمال بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. رئيس هذه الجلسة هو الدكتور هشام رويحي. Now we'll move on to the second sessions. Will be on challenges, realities, and options for business internationalization in the Middle East and North Africa region. This session will be chaired by Dr. Hisham Ruwehi. I will let him introduce the speaker.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Our second session for the day is about the challenges, realities, and options for business internationalization in the MENA region. And we are happy to be joined by our speakers, Mr. David Quick and Ms. Heidi Humla and Mrs. Sarah Mubarak. Our first speaker is Mr. David Quick, who is the professor at International Entrepreneurship Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Professor Quick has worked in academia since 1988. He joined Victoria University, New Zealand in 2010 as a professor of international entrepreneurship. Before moving to New Zealand, he was employed in various academic roles at Leicester University and the University of Strathclyde and University of Leicester before holding chairs in marketing and international entrepreneurship at both Birmingham City University and De Montfort University in the UK. I would like to welcome Mr. David, who is going to be speaking about Born Global, Die Local.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you for John and the team for inviting me. In terms of the issue that we're looking at today, there's a key question that a lot of people, not just in academia where I fundamentally work, of course, but in terms of consulting roles, that might work with incubators and things like that, do firms need to rapidly internationalise to avoid being unsuccessful, whatever that means, and we're going to clarify that in a minute, in their domestic market. What I'm actually going to focus on are differences between different types of firms. So they're all rapidly internationalised, but they're going to differ in terms of the intensity, the scale as it's known, of their international activities, and the scope, in other words, the number of markets that they're going to. They're all UK high-tech firms because I spend a lot of time in the UK as well as my host country of New Zealand. So what's the takeout issue from all this? Well, if we hear terms such as international new ventures or the more sexy term, born globals, does it really matter? Is it just an academic issue, or in terms of practitioners, does it really make a difference? And if it does, to whom? Is it the entrepreneurs themselves, the investors, policymakers, incubators, etc.? So let's just start with the although this is UK firms I'm talking about, my host city of Wellington, where I've moved to in New Zealand, I don't need to take you through this because incubators are being covered quite a bit, but I just wanted to draw your attention to what is expected within 12 months. You've got to, otherwise they're poor funding, have some kind of international presence. So in terms of rapid internationalisation, that's one takeout. Certain expectations from incubators throughout the world, if you're not having an identified presence in overseas markets pretty damn quick, you're out of there, funding's withdrawn. So let's just get back to some of the basics. And Steve Blank, who a lot of you will have heard of, very successful entrepreneur in his own right, but also an investor, asked us some fundamental questions. What's a startup? And I'm going to clarify that in a moment because it is important in the context of what we're talking about in this conference. We keep hearing this term entrepreneur, but is it this homogeneous group of people, or do entrepreneurs differ? And if so, in what way? Who they are, what they know, and who they know. And also in terms of the ecosystems which keeps being mentioned, does that make a difference as well? Does that actually stimulate some of these rapid internationalising firms? And also where the funding is actually coming from, the public or private sector. So I said I'm going to clarify startup firms in a moment. Let's do that now. Two groups are actually highlighted here, but we shouldn't forget the others. We keep talking about this, but we kind of like dismiss a group. Well, some are lifestyle entrepreneurs, some are just starting small business, some are even social entrepreneurs. We've even seen incubators growing up around the world that are just focused on these social entrepreneurs. We've also got startups being broken out, if you want to use an academic term, intrapreneurship or the corporate venturing, these spin-outs from these larger organisations. But what I actually want to talk about is two groups. Those who are born to be big and those that are born to flip. In other words, going to, as a core objective, sell out pretty quick. And why does that matter? Well, it's the objectives of managers or entrepreneurs that actually matter, because that affects decision making. If you're not getting into those key markets, either to grow your firms or to bring people who are interested in buying you out on board pretty quick, then probably your objectives are going to actually suffer. So, being an academic, I know that there's a few academics around the group, you'd be disappointed if I didn't have some citations, but don't worry, I'm keeping them to a minimum. What's a bit of history? Okay, in the old days, pre-internet and things like that, there was this argument that firms should take a gradual step into internationalisation. In other words, you would actually get your base developed in your domestic market, you'd then probably pick a low risk mode, such as exporting, go to a culturally close market, and then expand further away. And when you're expanding further away, probably going to high commitment modes. Well, we know that life's moved on from that. Recent studies have shown a number of different patterns. Well, in certain sectors, if you don't target the lead markets pretty damn quick, you're out of there. You have got to target what is your key market. Let's take, for example, life sciences. If you're not in the US, in a lot of cases, okay, your history. Others are more reactive rather than proactive, and they may have just a limited domestic market. You think of some of the Scandinavian countries, New Zealand, which incidentally, being the other side of the world, suffers from reliability of foreigners, as it's called. Okay, got to go international. Some are more reactive in the sense of they're getting unsolicited orders, and some people actually call that serendipity. Other actually, on the more entrepreneurship side, people say that entrepreneurs are always scanning out, they're being alert to opportunities. So in fact, they're more proactive and shouldn't actually see that as reactive in nature. Tangible resources are also important, and some of the funding streams we've been talking about is important, but also the intangibility, the social capital, things like that. What are the objectives? How are decisions being made? How committed are you? All of these kind of things are very important. But outside of that, the programs that we've been talking about, and not least of which, some of the investors, our last speakers, for example, were just talking about, is not just the funds, but also the know-how of some of these investors, so that's driving strategies. But here's a key thing, we shouldn't see internationalisation as always good. Firms are, or shall we call them entrepreneurs, firms don't make decisions, it's entrepreneurs or management teams that make decisions, are withdrawing and re-internationalising quite a bit of a time. So we've got to bear that in mind. You shouldn't actually see market withdrawal always as a market failure. It can be, but what can we learn from that? And do you do some kind of strategic renewal, some kind of turnaround to actually learn from that and get better next time round? So, ask yourself, we keep hearing about these ideas that we may have. It may be really cool if you want to use a young person's term, or older people like me, it's really great, but nobody wants it. But if they do, can you evidence it? Can you evidence that demand? Can you convince the investors, say, who they are, where they are, and how you might actually have to adapt to meet needs profitably? Okay, don't worry, there's only one more slide with the references on. So we hear this term born global, and it's this really sexy term that's kind of grown up, popularised by McKinsey. I think it was 1993 if I remember right, but it's been cited on a number of occasions. But what does it actually mean? Well, the award-winning article that's just had its 10-year celebration in the Journal of International Business Studies actually described it like this: young entrepreneurial startups that initiate international business, brackets typically exporting, soon after inception. Does that really mean global, or does it just mean international? Another one, we hear the term international new ventures used synonymously with born global. Again, you can read this on the slide just as much as I can. but a business organisation from inception that seeks to derive significant competitive advantage from the use of resources and sale of outputs to multiple countries. Well, now we're starting to get more realistic, but those multiple countries don't necessarily have to be globally based. There may just be a number of countries within a particular region. So, in short, I'm not telling you something you don't already know. I'm just trying to clarify that when we use the term born global, it's not always globally in nature. So that brings us on to the debate. Well, sometimes people say in terms of speed, what do we mean by that? And they use inception, sometimes 3 years, which is the key one, and one I'm going to use today, sometimes 6 years. And because academics like to have large sampling frames, that's probably where the 6 years come in. But in reality, 6 years is a hell of a long time. I'd hardly say that that's new. So a lot of the academics actually have got flawed data. Sometimes people actually say, well, does it really matter in terms of the scale, the percentage of exports or international business as a percentage of your total turnover? And does it actually matter where they're going to? Is it just regionally based? Is it just simply the number of countries? Have you got some kind of global presence, which sometimes people see as the core triad nations or areas, if you like, of Europe, North America, Southeast Asia? Okay, let's get down to the research methods. And because academics like 2x2 matrices, you'd be very disappointed if I didn't present one today. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. But, very quickly, 16 interviews, 4 in each cell. These were derived from an existing database. They're all independently owned, so they didn't have parental decision-making. They're all high-tech firms. They rapidly internationalised, which, as I've already said, was within 3 years, and within the UK, all smaller in nature. In terms of who it spoke to, key decision-maker, and there's bias in that in terms of you might have got different responses, but remember, if you were to talk to other people, would they have actually known, some of the key decisions being made? So the bias noted, but it's still acceptable, particularly since check questions and documents we use wherever possible. Okay, now for the 2x2 matrix. What I'm going to do is take you through the 4 cells and knock on the head this notion of born globals. In other words, a lot of academics, or indeed incubators, policymakers, use the term wrongly, in my humble opinion. So, all internationalised within 3 years. In terms of scale of involvement, we could have notional cut-offs. A lot of people use around 25%, and that differentiates between the low, I actually use 30%, between the low commitment and the high commitment. And in terms of the scope of activities, are they regionally based, or at least in 2 regions, or are they truly global, if you want to use the main triad regions to define global? A lot of people would say it's got to be more than that, but within that, if you're a marginal player, maybe you've only got 1% of your turnover going to it, are you really showing commitment to that? So what I actually did was to say they've got to have at least 10% of their turnover going to those 3, respectively, those 3 triad nations. Okay, so what were the key strategies? Those in Group 1, just to remind you, the marginal international new ventures, they targeted the lead market very quickly. This was based on knowledge and the networks that they had. But they wanted to minimise risk. They could de-internationalise if things went wrong. So risk minimisation strategy. That's not to say that they didn't accept ad hoc orders outside of that, but they definitely wanted a regional presence. Group 2, the aspiring born global. So again, a low commitment, but they are in fact now going closer towards this born global definition, going to the main triad markets. Complete opposite. They wanted to diversify risk. They still wanted to minimise the risk in terms of the mode, let us say they exported as opposed to going into more committed modes like foreign direct investment that had relatively low entry and exit barriers. But within that, some were more planned strategies than others. But the key thing is they wanted to exploit their technology early. In terms of the third group, here we're now starting to get much more commitment in overseas markets, but they're still regionally based. So the regional presence was important. Networks, experience counted for this. 2 had a low commitment mode of exporting. 1 exported but outsourced some of its R&D. The final one exported and had contract manufacturing. Their point of differentiation, if you like, was brought about by not just the what they could offer in the marketplace as a differentiated product, but they could also produce it cheaply by going into Southeast Asia. And then we get what is closer to this magic term, born global, a high commitment in a spread of markets. And the common strategies, these guys had a real global vision from inception. The triad markets were important. They wanted to exploit the technology before their competitors moved in. And that was determined, again, not just by this global vision, I have to say, also who was actually backing them. So their networks, this knowledge base that we heard in the last session, as well as the money, played a key role. So where does this take us? What is the so what issue from that? Let's remind ourselves of the question I asked. Do firms have to rapidly internationalise to avoid being unsuccessful in their domestic market? Well, it depends. We know, we've heard it a couple of times today already, many ventures fail. It depends on the objectives. And if we are in fact, as opinion leaders, coaches, whatever our role is, trying to get firms to internationalise too quickly without the preparation, going into the wrong markets, we're still risking failure. But it probably depends on the sector, and I've given you examples already. Sometimes you have got to target those lead markets. It depends on the ecosystem, a term we keep hearing being used. And for that matter, unlike the high-tech firms,